The night was eerily silent. The city, usually alive with the hum of car engines and distant conversations, seemed to be holding its breath. David sat in his high-rise apartment, staring at the skyline, lost in thought. He had everything a man could desire: wealth, power, influence. But tonight, something gnawed at his soul. He had been ignoring a voice, a persistent whisper in the depths of his heart, one that had been trying to reach him for years. David had built his empire from the ground up. Once a struggling young man, he had clawed his way to the top, sacrificing friendships, love, and even his own peace of mind. The world called him a millionaire, a genius entrepreneur, but inside, he felt hollow. No amount of luxury could fill the void that had been growing within him. Tonight, as he scrolled through the news on his phone, something caught his eye. A headline blared, "Homeless man's final words before dying. God is crying." The word struck him like a thunderbolt. He clicked on the article, his heart pounding. The story was about an old man who had been living on the streets for years. He had been seen often, preaching on the corners of the city, warning people about their choices, telling them that God was weeping for humanity's ignorance. People dismissed him as insane, a relic of broken dreams. And yet, just before he died, he had muttered a message that had shaken those who heard it. God is crying loudly because no one is listening. David closed his eyes. He had seen the man before. A year ago, while rushing to a meeting, he had noticed him sitting on the steps of an old church. Their eyes had met briefly, and David felt something inexplicable, a pull, a strange familiarity. But he had looked away, too engrossed in his own ambitions. The weight of regret settled on his chest. That old man had tried to speak to him once. He had reached out a trembling hand, but David had ignored him, walking past with an air of indifference. And now he was gone. A storm raged inside David. He had spent his life believing that money was the ultimate goal, that success was measured in numbers. But was it? If he had everything, why did he feel so empty? Unable to shake the feeling, David decided to take a walk. He left his penthouse and stepped into the cold night. The streets were deserted, and the city lights flickered like distant stars. His feet led him unknowingly to the same church where he had last seen the old man. The church was old, its walls weathered by time. As David entered, a strange stillness filled the air. He walked down the aisle and sat on a wooden pew. The silence was deafening, pressing against his soul. He lowered his head, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Then a voice, soft yet commanding, echoed in his mind. "You have ears, but you do not listen. You have eyes, but you do not see. You chase shadows while the truth waits in the light." David's breath caught. Was he imagining things? He looked around, but the church was empty. His heart pounded wildly. And then memories flooded him. Times he had ignored kindness, moments he had dismissed love, people he had abandoned for the sake of his ambitions. The weight of his choices crashed down on him, and for the first time in years, tears welled in his eyes. He knelt down, a sob escaping his lips. "God, have I failed?" he whispered. A soft gust of wind brushed against his face, as if an unseen hand was comforting him. And in that moment he knew he had spent his life listening to the wrong voices. The voice of greed, of pride, of selfish ambition. But now, another voice called him, one that had always been there, waiting. David knew what he had to do. He had ignored the message before, but not anymore. The time had come to listen, to change, to truly live. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of urgency. He had spent most of the night in the church, reflecting on the emptiness that had consumed him. Now, he was determined to do something meaningful. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. His first stop was a shelter where the old man had occasionally stayed. The workers recognized him immediately. "He always spoke about people like you," one of them said, "the ones with everything but nothing at the same time." David felt a pang in his chest. Did he leave anything behind? Anything I should know? The worker nodded and handed him a tattered notebook. He wrote in this every day. "Maybe there's something in there for you." David opened the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with words of wisdom, messages of love, hope, and divine warnings. But one passage stood out. "If you are reading this, Then perhaps my voice was not lost in the wind. You are searching for something, but you must realize it was never missing. It was always within you. The world is loud, but the truth is quiet. Listen to the quiet. Tears blurred David's vision. The words felt as though they had been written for him, as if the old man had always known he would come looking one day. He closed the book and took a deep breath. His journey was only beginning. But for the first time in his life, he knew he was on the right path. Days turned into weeks, and David dedicated himself to a new mission. He used his wealth not to build his empire, but to build lives. He funded shelters, provided food to hungry, and most importantly, he listened. He listened to forgotten voices, the ones drowned out by the noise of the world. One evening, as he sat in the same church, a young man entered, looking lost, just as David had been. Their eyes met, and David felt that same pull, that strange familiarity. The cycle was beginning again. He stood up and approached the young man, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sit with me," he said. "Let me tell you a story." For the first time in years, David truly understood. God wasn't crying because people didn't have wealth, power, or success. God was crying because they weren't listening. But now David was, and that made all the difference.